last flight of JL-123, August 12th, 1985. It was just another ordinary Monday in Tokyo. The sky shimmered with hues of gold as the sun prepared to dip behind the horizon. Haneda Airport buzzed with life, a mosaic of hurried footsteps, cheerful reunions, and quiet goodbyes. Among the travelers stood 509 passengers and 15 crew members boarding Japan Airlines Flight 123. Destination Osaka. The aircraft, a Boeing 747 SR-46, stood proud and towering on the tarmac. The SR in its name stood for Short Range, a model designed specifically for domestic flights in Japan with increased seating capacity. It had completed thousands of journeys until today. Captain Masami Takahama, a seasoned pilot with over 12,000 flight hours, prepared for takeoff with First Officer Yutaka Sasaki and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda. None of them knew this would be the most harrowing flight of their lives. At 6:12 p.m., Flight 123 lifted off smoothly from Haneda Airport. The passengers settled in. Business travelers reviewed notes, children giggled over comics, and families relaxed, looking forward to dinner at home. The mood in the cabin was light, casual, unaware of the invisible hand of fate tightening its grip. 12 minutes into the flight, at 6:24 p.m., a sound echoed through the cockpit. Loud, jarring, unnatural. Bang! The plane lurched. Warning lights flooded the control panel. A violent shudder ran through the aircraft as an explosive decompression tore through the rear of the plane. Unknown to the passengers and crew, the rear pressure bulkhead, a key structural component, had failed catastrophically. In the cockpit, alarms blared. The crew scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. They couldn't control the rudder. The elevators weren't responding. The plane's hydraulics, its lifeline, had been severed. The pilots fought to regain control, using engine thrust as their only tool. Back in the cabin, terror took root. Oxygen masks dropped, but they weren't working properly. The sudden drop in pressure and the violent shaking triggered chaos. Luggage flew from overhead bins. People screamed. Children cried. Flight attendants, still holding to their training, urged passengers to stay calm. The aircraft, now flying without control, began to climb and descend in a deadly rhythm. Phugoid motion, it's called. A helpless pattern of rise and fall, like a dying bird flapping its wings for the last time. Meanwhile, air traffic control in Tokyo tried to understand the situation. The crew managed to radio a distress call, uncontrollable. They requested to return to Haneda. The controller cleared them immediately, but the aircraft wasn't responding to commands. It began veering off course toward the rugged mountains of Gunma Prefecture. Inside, people began writing messages, last words, on airline notepads and scraps of paper. To my family, I love you. Take care of the children. Goodbye. A stewardess, still standing amid the shaking, whispered prayers under her breath. Some passengers held hands, others closed their eyes, already surrendering to fate. For nearly 32 minutes, the pilots fought an impossible battle, manually adjusting engine power to steer the aircraft, trying to avoid disaster. But without hydraulics, their efforts were in vain. At 6:56 p.m., the nightmare ended. Flight 123 slammed into the ridge of Mount Takamagahara at over 300 miles per hour. The sound of the impact echoed across the mountains like a monstrous roar. A fireball lit up the dusk sky. Trees ignited, metal twisted and screeched. And then, silence. The wreckage sprawled across a forested mountainside. The forward section of the plane was utterly destroyed. The tail had disintegrated mid-air. Fires raged. Smoke curled into the sky like a signal of sorrow. Yet, amidst the devastation, life. Miraculously, 4 passengers survived. Rescue efforts, tragically delayed by miscommunication and lack of clarity, didn't reach the crash site until the next morning. When they did, they found scenes no words could truly capture. Scenes of heartbreak, bravery, and unspeakable loss. One of the survivors, 12-year-old girl Yumi Ochai, had been seated in the rear with her mother and sister. Thrown clear of the wreckage by some quirk of physics, she lay unconscious on the forest floor. Her mother and sister did not survive. A flight attendant, Hiroshi Fukuda, was also found alive, barely clinging to consciousness. His injuries were severe, but he had tried to help others before collapsing. 2 other women also survived, both suffering from serious trauma and burns. The investigation that followed revealed the tragic cause. 7 years earlier, The aircraft had suffered a tail strike during a landing. Boeing, the manufacturer, had performed repairs on the rear pressure bulkhead, but the repair had been done incorrectly. A critical splice plate was improperly installed, using one row of rivets instead of two. Over years and thousands of flights, fatigue cracks formed around the faulty repair. On that fateful evening, the bulkhead finally failed, causing explosive decompression. The force tore off the entire vertical stabilizer and ruptured all 4 hydraulic systems, a death sentence for any aircraft. The crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 remains the deadliest single-aircraft accident in history, claiming 520 lives. In the aftermath, Japan mourned. National grief took over television screens, schools held memorials, the airline industry re-examined its procedures, Boeing updated repair guidelines, and a monument was built at the crash site, a sacred place where families still climb to leave flowers, notes, and tears. But the story of JL123 is not just one of failure and tragedy, it is also a story of courage. Of pilots who never gave up, who fought against impossible odds, trying to save their passengers. Of passengers who faced death with love and dignity, leaving behind words that still bring tears decades later. Of survivors who carried the memory of 520 souls and the lessons learned that changed aviation forever. The mountain that claimed them is now called Osaka Ridge, a name whispered with reverence. And every year on August 12th, the names are read aloud, bells are rung, and Japan remembers. For in the sky that evening, something broke, not just metal, but hearts, lives, and the illusion that every takeoff always leads to a landing. But in the memory of those lost, there is flight still, not of planes, but of prayers, of love, and of stories that must never be forgotten.